You're often interested in sex, and the idea of dying doesn't make you happy, so congratulations, that's very good news. You are a survivor, and you definitely belong to the great story of life. You are one of the last descendants of heroes, heirs to a long tradition of torchbearers, who all, in the end, always end up fading away. This adventure of yesterday and today can be represented by giving it, on paper, the shape commonly known as the Great Tree of Life. The first attempts to represent this great story of evolution tended to flatter us and often placed the human being and his mammalian navel at the center, or rather at the top, as a kind of culmination. Except now we know that sapiens dates back about 300,000 years, and above all, that it is just one branch of this tree among many others, all of which are also at the top. That's why it's more accurate to represent the history of evolution as a large bush. A bush that has, on its periphery, the millions of species still alive on Earth today. On this strange tree, the organisms that seem the most basic are represented at the same level as plants, fungi, bacteria, or animals. From the smallest to the largest, from the simplest to the most complex, all are the result of a very long journey. As for us hominids, we are here, close to chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. And by diving into this bush of life, we go back in time. Here, at this branch, is the common ancestor of all the great apes, including us, and which has now disappeared. The inside of the bush is the past. And this past is much stranger than it seems. Heading toward the center, we see that all forms of life converge toward a common ancestry going back billions of years. Whether you start from a frog, a bluefin tuna, a robin, barley or wheat, a bacterium or an archaeon, you will always end up at the same point in this family tree. The one we call LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, the unicellular organism from which the entire tree of life originates. LUCA has obviously never been found. He lived in a past that is far too distant, but traces of his existence can be found at the heart of all the cells of all living beings today. Engraved in the molecular arrangement of ribosomes, microscopic structures found in the cells of all living things, which are capable of transforming genetic code into proteins. It is believed that some elements of this molecular machine are simply too complex to have appeared independently several times during evolution. LUCA, as extraordinary as he is just the oldest hypothetical living being who connects everything alive today, and whose trace has remained engraved in the genome of all his descendants. To go back that far, we had to dig into a secret library written in a 4-letter alphabet, 4 nucleotides, A, T, C, G. This library, on the other hand, is written in words, coiled and folded inside the nucleus of each of our cells in the form of DNA. An amazing molecule thanks to which, beyond matter, information could endure through time. And that's why we resemble our parents. Our bodies spend their lives renewing themselves, our matter changes, but our organization, on the other hand, can remain. By studying and comparing the DNA unique to each species, by modeling mutation rates, by analyzing fossil remains, and by doing comparative anatomy, we are able to reconstruct more and more precisely the branches that connect us to all living things, to trace back all the way to LUCA. But let's repeat it. LUCA is not the first form of life to have existed on Earth. He is only the most recent ancestor of all currently known living forms. And it's not impossible that LUCA coexisted with other microscopic forms of life that could have, if they had had a long enough lineage, revealed to us even older branches of the tree of life, branches that have certainly disappeared forever into oblivion. Because the appearance of the first living organisms lies in even more obscure depths of the past. So LUCA is not a seed, but a branch, the furthest one we are able to trace back to. So, beyond LUCA's, what do we find? Well, precisely, we don't know. Life may have appeared several times, but only the descendants of LUCA's are still here. LUCA's is also the heir of extinct species, of damaged branches that no longer grow, located too far back in time for us to be able, for now, to reconstruct their history. But for events located closer to the surface of the bush, we have more data and information. By trying to reconstruct the history of distant family ties, we have, for example, discovered through the study of fossils that a branch continued to thrive and took off from the dinosaur branch, eventually giving rise to all the birds we know today. And perhaps even more extraordinary, we also realize that unicellular organisms without nuclei, like archaea and bacteria, which at first glance under a microscope seem as similar as two drops of water, actually have very distinct biochemistry and DNA. These huge differences are therefore very ancient. These two major branches of the tree of life, archaea and bacteria, are actually more distant from each other than a cactus is from a hyena. In short, diving into the tree of life is sure to give you a headache, especially since we've discovered that these branches can be much more intertwined and connected than they seem. Because microscopic life forms, like bacteria and archaea, which are still very much alive today, are capable, without reproduction coming into play, of literally passing pieces of DNA to each other. And this phenomenon of horizontal gene transfer also happens more discreetly in multicellular organisms like us. In particular, through viruses, which by hijacking cells' DNA to reproduce can implant pieces of DNA from a previous host. The traces of these exchanges, which may have taken place in the very distant past, are still present in us today in our genetic code. And to illustrate the incredibly complex and sometimes downright crazy connections that have developed over time between the different parts of the tree, let's focus on the third major branch of life, the eukaryotes, which include plants, fungi, and animals. In these organisms, the cell nuclei contain most of their DNA, but not all of it, because some strange organelles in these organisms have their own genetic code. They are, in a way, cells within cells. These are the mitochondria, found in animals and essential for energy production, or the plastids, found in plant cells, which perform the miracle of photosynthesis. The existence of these molecular structures, which are vital for the proper functioning of our cells, is something we most likely inherited from a form of parasitism. Because it is believed that these organelles are derived from bacteria, which, after being trapped inside an archaeon, remained there, leaving behind their genetic material, and eventually gave rise to giant cells, the eukaryotic cells, which are ours. In other words, mitochondria and plastids are, in a way, the descendants of cells that started living inside other cells. This evolutionary sleight of hand, which we call endosymbiosis, shows us that two living beings, two very different species from separate branches of the tree of life, were able to live together, one inside the other, and eventually became a single entity. On our scale, it's a bit as if we started doing photosynthesis after eating some sage. And it's estimated that these endosymbioses have occurred more than 25 times independently over the course of evolution. From then on, with the discovery of this exotic evolutionary phenomenon, our bush of life gradually turns, at its base, into a kind of messy strangler fig, which still only partially matches reality. Because representing the history of life this way still suggests that all the species at the ends are independent, left to their own individual fate. Underlying this is the unconscious idea that each species could survive on its own. Yet, the vast majority of organisms belong to ecosystems, live in symbiosis with other species, and are interdependent on many other living beings, without whose existence they could not survive. In a way, our genetic code is not only found in the nucleus of our cells, but also concerns that of the species we closely depend on, and which are constantly involved in our metabolism. Because just as we would instantly collapse without our mitochondria, we wouldn't last a day perched on our primate branch without the billions of bacteria that inhabit our digestive system or our skin. This way of studying the DNA of an environment rather than an individual is called metagenomics. It tells us the real story of life on Earth, which is not only about species, but also about ecosystems. We owe our inner lives, whether digestive or emotional, at least in part, to little parts of ourselves that aren't really us. This relationship with the ecosystem extends far beyond symbiosis. Because one of the main branches of the tree we're perched on, commonly called the animal branch, is almost entirely dependent on other branches, which, unlike us, are essential for life. Because animals, like fungi for that matter, are heterotrophic organisms. In other words, to get energy and matter to stay alive, we have to eat living things. No human has ever produced their own organic matter. We get it from other organisms, but plants, on the other hand, could very well do without us because they are autotrophic, like cyanobacteria. That means they are able to feed themselves with sunlight, water, air, and minerals, which they turn into energy and organic matter. These living beings are therefore at the base of all food chains. So, evolution is not a ladder where each species tries to surpass its neighbor, but a messy scaffolding in which each ecosystem is constantly seeking its point of balance. The grand story that we are often told, which goes through bacteria, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and finally reaches mammals, which includes us, is only a tiny portion of an even vaster, delightfully chaotic epic that includes millions of different paths. So from the bottom of my mammalian heart, I congratulate you, because being currently on the edge of this great bush, you are, just like every living being on this planet, one of those millions of different and temporary finish lines, since evolution continues. If, after all that, you still see yourself as the optimum, the one on top, what does that say about you? Even on the world's most beautiful throne, you're just sitting on your butt or your branch. And if you're still trying to put yourself in the front row of the family photo, then I might just feel like putting an end to your entire lineage. Thank you to all the humans who have recently joined us on TPE, Utip, or through the join button. It's thanks to you that we can produce such crazy content. And if your name is Lucas, subscribe.